Crash! The sledgehammer shattered the pristine pool tiles as HOA President Brenda watched from her window. Cell phone already dialing 911. But what she didn't know was that I had just discovered her darkest secret, one that would turn our entire neighborhood upside down and destroy her life instead of mine. My name is Tyler Blake, and this happened in Willowbrook Estates. One of those picture-perfect suburban communities where every lawn is manicured and every mailbox matches. I'm a software engineer, recently divorced. And honestly, I just wanted to live quietly and figure out my new life. What I got instead was a war with the most dangerous type of person you can imagine, someone with a little power and zero accountability. This is the story of how one woman's obsession with control led to the biggest scandal our neighborhood had ever seen. And it all started with 3 words that would haunt Brenda forever. Violation notice issued. Look, I know we've all dealt with that one neighbor who thinks they own the entire street. If you've got your own HOA horror story, I genuinely want to hear it, because after what I went through, I realized I'm definitely not alone in this fight. But first, let me tell you exactly how this nightmare began. 6 months ago, my life imploded in the most ordinary way possible. Emma, my ex-wife, and I finalized our divorce after 18 years of marriage. It wasn't dramatic or hateful. We just grew apart. Wanted different things. Became different people. The kids, Sarah and Michael. 2 were spending the summer with Emma at her new place across town. And suddenly I found myself alone in this 4-bedroom house that felt like a museum of our former life. The pool had been the centerpiece of that life. We'd spent $35,000 installing it 5 years earlier, back when weekend barbecues and kids' birthday parties made our backyard the neighborhood gathering spot. Now, it sat empty, collecting leaves and costing me $200 a month in maintenance, chemicals, and utilities I couldn't afford. Between alimony, child support, and the mortgage on a house that was way too big for one person, something had to give. The decision to remove it wasn't emotional, it was mathematical. The pool covered 1,200 square feet of my backyard, space I could convert into a workshop and garden area. Sarah had gotten interested in botany during her freshman year of high school, and I thought maybe we could build raised beds together. Create something new from what used to be. The pool removal would save me $2,400 annually, and the new space might actually increase my property value. It seemed like the most logical decision I'd made in months. What I didn't know was that in Willowbrook Estates, logic meant nothing. Here, appearances were everything, and Brenda was the self-appointed guardian of appearances. Brenda had been HOA president for 3 consecutive terms, which should have been my first red flag. At 54, she had the kind of aggressive maintenance that money could buy, and the personality of someone who'd never faced real adversity. She lived in the largest house on Maple Drive, a colonial monstrosity with columns that served no structural purpose except to announce her importance. Her late husband, Richard, had been some kind of contractor or developer. Honestly, nobody talked about him much. And Brenda certainly didn't. All I knew was that he died in a car accident 2 years ago. And since then, Brenda had thrown herself into HOA politics with the intensity of someone who needed to control something. Anything. To feel alive. Her campaigns for re-election always featured the same promises: protecting property values, maintaining community standards, and preserving the character of Willowbrook Estates. What that actually meant became clear pretty quickly after you moved here. Brenda had opinions about everything: the height of your grass, the color of your shutters, where you parked your car, how often you power washed your driveway. Most neighbors just went along with it because fighting seemed more exhausting than compliance. I should have known better than to think I could fly under her radar. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning in early June. I'd started the pool demolition the day before, working methodically with a rented jackhammer to break up the concrete in the shallow end. The noise was unavoidable, but I'd checked the HOA bylaws thoroughly. Construction activities were permitted between 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. on weekdays, and I was being extremely careful to stay within those boundaries. I'd even knocked on my immediate neighbors' doors to give them a heads up. Marcus Thompson, who lived to my left, had been completely supportive. About time someone did something practical around here, he'd said with a grin that suggested he had his own issues with the HOA. But apparently, courtesy and following the rules weren't enough. At 6:15 a.m., I discovered a bright red violation notice zip-tied to my front door handle. The paper was official-looking, printed on HOA letterhead with Brenda's signature stamped at the bottom in blue ink that somehow managed to look angry. Notice of major violation. Unauthorized property modification. Homeowner Tyler Blake has commenced significant landscape modification without proper notification or approval from the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association Board of Directors. This activity constitutes a violation of Community Standards Section 4. 7. Major landscape changes. Immediate cessation of all activity is required. Failure to comply will result in escalating fines and potential legal action. Current fine assessed, $500. 0 due within 72 hours. Mandatory hearing scheduled for Friday, June 9th, 7 p.m. in the community center. Attendance is required. I read it 3 times, feeling my blood pressure climb with each pass. I'd lived in Willowbrook Estates for 8 years. I'd served on the Holiday Decoration Committee, volunteered for neighborhood cleanups, never missed an HOA dues payment. I knew these bylaws better than most board members. And nowhere, absolutely nowhere, did they mention that pool removal required advance approval. The morning sun was already getting hot as I marched across the street to Brenda's house. Her front yard was a masterpiece of professional landscaping. Every plant perfectly positioned, every edge razor sharp. The American flag hanging from her porch was pressed and crisp, fluttering in the breeze like it had been ironed that morning. Everything about her property screamed control and perfection. I rang the doorbell and waited, holding the violation notice in my hand, like evidence of a crime. When Brenda opened the door, she was already dressed for the day in a cream-colored blazer and matching pants. Her blonde hair styled into what I'd come to think of as her authority helmet, immovable and slightly intimidating. "Tyler," she said, her voice carrying the tone of a disappointed teacher. "I was wondering when you'd come by." "Brenda, there's been a mistake." I held up the notice. "I checked the bylaws thoroughly before starting this project. Pool removal isn't mentioned anywhere in the landscape modification guidelines." Her smile was sharp and practiced. Section 4. 7 is quite clear about major landscape changes, affecting property, aesthetics, and drainage patterns. Removing a permanent structure certainly qualifies. That section talks about adding structures, not removing them. And it specifically mentions decks, gazebos, and outbuildings. There's nothing about pools. The language is including but not limited to. "Tyler, that gives the board discretionary authority to evaluate any changes that might impact the community." She stepped onto her porch, closing the door behind her. "Look, I understand you're going through a difficult time with the divorce and everything, but we can't let personal circumstances override community standards." The way she said difficult time made my skin crawl. It was sympathetic in tone but dismissive in substance. Like my life changes were an inconvenience, she was graciously tolerating. "This has nothing to do with my personal life," I said, working to keep my voice level. "This is about improving my property and following the established rules, which is exactly why we have a hearing process. Friday night, 7 p.m. We'll discuss it properly with the full board." Her smile never wavered. "I'm sure we can work something out that benefits everyone." There was something in her tone that made me uncomfortable, a confidence that suggested the outcome had already been decided. But I nodded and walked back to my house, telling myself that logic and documentation would prevail. The bylaws were clear. My project was reasonable, and surely 5 rational adults could see that. I spent the next 3 days preparing for the hearing like I was defending a doctoral thesis. I printed copies of every relevant bylaw, researched property values in neighborhoods with and without pools, gathered documentation showing that my project would actually increase home values in the area. I even found several real estate studies proving that removing outdated pools was a smart investment strategy. Marcus Thompson stopped by Wednesday evening while I was reviewing my notes in the backyard. He was a retired electrician in his 60s, the kind of neighbor who'd loan you tools and help carry heavy furniture without being asked. His wife had passed away 3 years ago, and since then, he'd become the unofficial guardian of neighborhood common sense. "How you holding up?" he asked, looking at the half-demolished pool with obvious approval. "Getting ready for the hearing tomorrow. Brenda seems pretty determined to shut this down." Marcus snorted. "Brenda's determined to shut down a lot of things lately. You notice how many violation notices have been floating around the neighborhood recently? I hadn't. Actually. What do you mean? The Johnsons got cited for their garden shed being 6 inches too close to the property line. The Williamses got fined for having their garbage cans visible from the street for more than 12 hours. Old Mrs. Patterson got written up because her rose bush was growing through the fence. He shook his head. Used to be. Neighbors would just talk to each other about stuff like that. Maybe she's just trying to be thorough about enforcement. Maybe. Marcus gave me a look that suggested he knew something I didn't. Just be careful. Tyler. Brenda's been acting strange lately. More intense. If you know what I mean. Like she's got some kind of agenda beyond just keeping the hedges trimmed. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important. I drove through the neighborhood after dinner, paying attention to details I'd never noticed before. Sure enough, there were signs of Brenda's recent enforcement campaign everywhere. Freshly painted house numbers where violation notices had apparently demanded improvements. Gardens that looked like they'd been hastily reorganized. Even small things like doormat placements and mailbox positions seemed slightly off, like people had been forced to make adjustments. But there was something else. Something that nagged at me until I finally figured out what it was. 3 houses on different streets had for sale signs that looked relatively new. In 8 years of living here, I'd rarely seen more than 1 house on the market at a time. Willowbrook Estates was the kind of place people moved to and stayed in until retirement or major life changes forced them out. Friday night arrived with the oppressive humidity that Virginia summers are famous for. The community center was a beige brick building that doubled as our voting location and the site of various neighborhood social events. By 6:45 p.m., the main meeting room was packed with more residents than I'd ever seen at an HOA gathering. Word had apparently spread that this would be more interesting than the usual discussions about landscaping budgets and holiday decorations. Brenda sat at the head table with the other 4 board members. David Chen, a nervous-looking accountant who always seemed uncomfortable with confrontation. Patricia Williams, a retired school principal with a reputation for fairness. Robert Martinez, a lawyer who'd moved to the neighborhood 6 months ago. And Janet Morrison, whose primary qualification seemed to be agreement with whatever Brenda suggested. Good evening, everyone. Brenda called the meeting to order with a wooden gavel that seemed unnecessarily large. We have several items on tonight's agenda. But first we'll address the violation hearing for Tyler Blake regarding unauthorized property modification. She gestured for me to approach the front of the room. I'd dressed professionally, khakis, button-down shirt, tie, trying to project competence and reasonableness. As I walked forward, I could feel dozens of eyes on me. Neighbors I'd waved to for years now, evaluating me like I was on trial. Tyler, you've been cited for removing your swimming pool without proper board approval. Would you like to present your defense? The word defense rankled me, but I kept my voice steady. Thank you. Brenda, I'd like to clarify that this isn't really a defense, since no violation has occurred. I've carefully reviewed our community bylaws, and pool removal isn't listed among the activities requiring board approval. I distributed copies of the relevant sections to the board members and began my presentation. I explained the financial rationale, the property value research, the potential benefits to the community. I showed before and after renderings of my planned garden and workshop space. I even provided documentation showing that my project would improve drainage, not harm it. Patricia Williams asked several thoughtful questions about timeline and methodology. David Chen seemed genuinely interested in the financial analysis. Even Robert Martinez nodded approvingly at several points. For a moment, I thought rational discourse might actually prevail. Then Brenda stood up. I appreciate Tyler's thorough preparation, she said, her voice carrying across the room with practiced authority. But what we're really discussing here isn't the technical details of one homeowner's project. We're talking about the fundamental question of community standards and property values. She began pacing in front of the board table, and I realized this was a performance she'd rehearsed. Willowbrook Estates has maintained its desirability and property values because we've consistently enforced high standards. When we allow individual homeowners to make major changes without community input, we're essentially saying that personal convenience matters more than collective investment. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Brenda was hitting exactly the right notes. Community, property values, collective responsibility. She was making me sound selfish for wanting to improve my own property. Furthermore, she continued, we've recently been made aware of several properties in our community that are being marketed specifically because of our reputation for maintaining standards. Real estate agents are telling prospective buyers that Willowbrook Estates is different from other neighborhoods because we don't allow just anyone to tear up their property whenever they feel like it. That was news to me. And apparently to several other people in the room based on the surprised expressions I could see. I move that we uphold the violation and require Mr. Blake to restore his property to its original condition within 30 days. Additionally, I recommend we establish a new policy requiring board approval for any landscape modification exceeding $500 in value or involving permanent structures. I second the motion, Janet Morrison said immediately. The vote was swift and decisive, 4 in favor, 1 abstention from Patricia Williams, who looked genuinely uncomfortable with the proceedings. Just like that, my reasonable project had become a violation requiring expensive restoration. As the crowd began to disperse, I felt a hand on my shoulder. Marcus Thompson had worked his way through the departing neighbors to reach me. That was a setup, he said quietly. Brenda knew exactly how this was going to go before you ever walked in here. What do you mean? He glanced around to make sure no one was listening, then pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. I did some digging after our conversation the other day. You need to check the public records for something called Harrington Development LLC. I unfolded the paper. It contained a business registration number and an address I didn't recognize. What is this? Brenda's been busy since Richard died. Real busy. And I don't think it's just about maintaining community standards. Marcus looked around the room again, his expression grim. Those houses that are for sale? The families that got harassment campaigns from violation notices? There's a pattern here. Tyler, and you just became part of it. The community center was nearly empty now. Just a few board members cleaning up and stacking chairs. Brenda was gathering her papers with the satisfied efficiency of someone whose work was complete. When she noticed me still standing there, she offered another of her sharp smiles. I hope you understand this isn't personal. Tyler, sometimes we have to make difficult decisions for the greater good of the community. Right, I said, still processing Marcus's revelation. The greater good. As I walked to my car, my mind was racing. Harrington Development, LLC. Real estate agents marketing the neighborhood standards. A pattern of violation notices targeting specific homeowners. Suddenly, my pool removal wasn't just about saving money and creating garden space. It was about something much bigger, much more calculated. And Brenda Harrington was at the center of it all. I drove home through the quiet streets of Willowbrook Estates, seeing my neighborhood with completely different eyes. Every perfectly maintained lawn, every matching mailbox, every pristine driveway suddenly looked less like community pride and more like evidence of control. Somewhere in this maze of suburban perfection, a woman with too much power and not enough oversight was playing a game that none of us understood. But I was about to change that. Because Marcus was right, this was a setup. And if Brenda thought she could use the HOA as her personal weapon to manipulate property values and drive out neighbors who didn't fit her plans, she was about to learn that some people fight back. The question was, just how far was she willing to go to protect her secret? And what would she do when she realized that I was no longer just a problem to be solved, but a threat to everything she'd been building? I was about to find out. The next morning, I was at the county courthouse by 8 a.m., pulling public records for Harrington Development LLC. What I discovered made my blood run cold. Brenda hadn't just been enforcing HOA rules. She'd been systematically targeting homeowners for harassment, then swooping in through her development company to buy their properties at below-market prices when they got fed up and decided to sell. Over the past 18 months, she'd acquired 6 properties in Willowbrook Estates, always from families who'd been hit with escalating violation notices and fines. The documentation showed a calculated timeline: violation notice, escalating fines, harassment campaigns, and finally lowball purchase offers that desperate homeowners accepted just to escape. The Johnsons, who'd been cited for their garden shed placement, they'd sold to Harrington Development for $40,000 below market value. The Williamses, with their garbage can violations, sold 2 months later. Mrs. Patterson's rosebush incident had led to her moving to a senior community, selling her house for $70,000 less than comparable properties. But here's the truly diabolical part. Brenda was buying low and selling high to developers who wanted to tear down our neighborhood and build luxury condominiums. She was literally destroying the community she claimed to protect, one violation notice at a time. The irony was devastating. While preaching about property values and community standards, she was systematically undermining both for personal profit. Each family she drove away weakened the social fabric that made Willowbrook Estates special in the first place. I called Rebecca Martinez. The investigative journalist Marcus had mentioned. Rebecca had been tracking HOA corruption across 3 counties. And when I explained what I'd found, she was at my house within an hour. "This is bigger than you think," she said, spreading documents across my kitchen table. "Brenda's not just running a real estate scam. She's been embezzling HOA funds to finance her property purchases. Look at these financial statements." The evidence was overwhelming. Inflated landscaping contracts that never resulted in actual work. Emergency repairs to community facilities that somehow cost 3 times the normal rate. Assessment fees that disappeared into accounts controlled by Harrington Development. "We need to expose this publicly," Rebecca said. "But first, we need her to incriminate herself." That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I was going to finish demolishing my pool, knowing full well that Brenda would escalate. And this time, we'd be ready for her. Monday morning, I fired up the jackhammer at exactly 8 a.m. By 8:15, Brenda was standing at my property line, her face twisted with rage. "Tyler Blake, you stop this immediately. You're in direct violation of the board's decision." "Actually, Brenda, I'm appealing that decision. Until the appeal is resolved, I'm allowed to continue my legally permitted activity. I'd done my homework this time." "Legal?" She laughed, but there was desperation in it. "I'll show you legal. I'm calling the police right now. Go ahead," I said, continuing to break up concrete. "Call them." What Brenda didn't know was that Rebecca was recording everything from Marcus's backyard, and that I'd already spoken with Officer Janet Rodriguez about the situation. When the police arrived 20 minutes later, they found me calmly working with proper permits while Brenda screamed about property destruction and neighborhood safety. "Ma'am, this gentleman has all the required permits," Officer Rodriguez said after reviewing my documentation. "His work is completely legal. But the HOA violation is a civil matter between you and Mr. Blake. We can't enforce HOA rules that contradict municipal law." That's when Brenda made her fatal mistake. Frustrated and desperate, she began ranting about how my project would ruin property values for the significant investments being made in neighborhood improvements. "What investments?" Officer Rodriguez asked. Suddenly interested, Brenda realized she'd said too much. But it was too late. "Just general community enhancement projects, Mrs. Harrington," I said, pulling out my phone with Rebecca's article already loaded. Would these be the same investments mentioned in today's County Herald? Rebecca had worked through the night. Her article, HOA President's Secret Real Estate Empire Built on Neighbor Harassment. It was already going viral online. The headline alone was devastating. But the financial documentation was irrefutable. Officer Rodriguez read the article on my phone, her expression growing darker with each paragraph. "Mrs. Harrington, I think you need to come with us to answer some questions about these allegations. This is ridiculous. These are lies and fabrications from a disgruntled homeowner." But more neighbors were gathering now. Having seen the article shared across social media, Patricia Williams, the board member who'd abstained from the vote, pushed through the crowd with her own printed copies. "Brenda, is this true? Have you been using violation notices to force people to sell their homes?" The crowd was getting larger and angrier. Families who'd been harassed, fined, and intimidated were finally understanding that they'd been victims of an elaborate fraud. David Chen, the nervous accountant, was frantically calling other board members. Someone was demanding a forensic audit of HOA finances. "I was trying to protect this community," Brenda shouted, her composure finally cracking. "Property values, community standards, someone has to maintain them. By stealing from your neighbors?" Marcus Thompson stepped forward, holding a thick folder. "By embezzling community funds? By destroying families' lives for profit?" The police investigation moved quickly after that. Within a week, Brenda was facing criminal charges for fraud, embezzlement, and abuse of office. The 6 properties she'd acquired were seized as evidence. Her development company declared bankruptcy when investigators froze all assets. The financial audit revealed she'd stolen over $200,000 from community funds, money that should have gone to actual neighborhood improvements. Several families who'd been forced to sell were now exploring lawsuits to recover their losses, but the most satisfying moment came 3 weeks later. During the emergency HOA meeting where we voted her out of office, the community center was packed again. But this time the energy was completely different. Instead of intimidation and manipulation, there was solidarity and purpose. "I want to thank Tyler Blake," said Patricia Williams, who'd been elected as interim president. His courage to fight back exposed a corruption that could have destroyed our entire neighborhood. The applause was thunderous. But what meant more to me were the individual conversations afterward. Mrs. Patterson, who'd moved back from the senior community, thanked me for giving her the strength to reclaim her home. The Johnsons were exploring legal action to recover their losses. Young families who'd been considering leaving Willowbrook Estates because of Brenda's harassment were making plans to stay. 6 months later, my backyard transformation was complete. The pool area had become a beautiful garden where Sarah and I spent weekends planting vegetables and flowers. Michael had helped me build a workshop where neighbors now gathered for tool sharing and community projects. Property values had actually increased once word spread about our reformed HOA's focus on actual community building rather than authoritarian control. We'd implemented new policies requiring transparent financial reporting, term limits for board positions, and neighbor voting on any fines exceeding $50. The monthly newsletters now featured neighbor spotlights and community achievements instead of violation warnings and compliance threats. Brenda plea bargained to avoid prison time, accepting probation and restitution payments that would take her years to complete. I heard she'd moved to an apartment complex across town. Though some neighbors claimed she was getting counseling to address the grief and control issues that had driven her to such desperate measures, Rebecca Martinez later told me that Brenda's case had become a model for prosecutors investigating HOA corruption in other counties. The legal precedent we'd established was helping other communities fight back against similar abuse. It turned out our small neighborhood battle had implications far beyond Willowbrook Estates. The real victory wasn't her downfall. It was what we built afterward. Our new HOA focused on helping neighbors rather than harassing them. We created community gardens, organized block parties, and developed support networks for families facing hardships. We proved that neighborhood associations could actually strengthen communities instead of terrorizing them. Sometimes I stand in my backyard in the evening, watching my kids play in the garden that used to be a pool, and I think about how close we came to losing everything to one person's manipulation and greed. The raised beds where Sarah grows her prize-winning tomatoes. The workshop where Michael learned to build birdhouses. None of this would exist if I'd simply accepted Brenda's authority without question. But I also think about the strength that emerges when ordinary people decide to fight back against bullies, no matter how much power they think they have. Because here's what I learned. The Brendas of the world count on our silence, our compliance, our fear of confrontation. They thrive when we accept their authority without question. But when communities stand together and demand accountability, even the most entrenched corruption crumbles. And that's a lesson worth sharing with everyone who's ever faced down a neighborhood tyrant and wondered if fighting back was worth it. Trust me completely. It truly always is. The cost of silence is always higher than the price of speaking truth to power. Always.